So we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to our next installment of At Home with Holland Home, the December version here at the end of the year of 2024. I think this is our 25th or 26th webinar we've done over the time, and our audience continues to build. So we're glad you could join us today. I'm Michael Loughman, Director of Sales here at Holland Home, and I'm joined by Adam Kinder, our Chief Financial Officer. We're going to talk a little bit about the importance of planning and doing some pre-planning and just kind of getting organized in life. You see our faces, but we're joined by the sales team with Victoria, Selena, Patty, Cindy are all on our webinar today. So those are names you might be familiar with. Our next webinar will be in January, and we're going to talk a lot about the real estate market. Sometimes in the new year, people want to list their home. What does that look like? What's the market trends? It's been, up and down a little bit, but still remains very strong, especially pricing. So we're going to talk a little bit about that with our friends at Greenridge. So stay tuned for that invitation. So have to give a little tease for our next webinar. If we'll have a presentation, as always, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you have questions along the way, if you would type those in the question and answer box, not the chat, just the question and answer, that would help us facilitate doing our best to get to all the questions that we can. So again, Adam, welcome. Thanks for joining today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. So we started talking about this topic about the importance of planning to make sure that people have kind of a comfortable and secure future because the market continues to change, demands are changing. So, Adam, in your experience, what have been some of the trends that you're seeing when it comes to making decisions in this realm of senior living and in care as we age? What are some of the trends you're seeing?
Yeah, I think nationally and even locally here, I mean, a lot of the national trends really get mimicked by regional and local trends here as well. But I mean, certainly what we've seen is we've seen the continued uptick and certainly in the volume of interest and engagement in the campuses that we operate, which we know is consistent with the experience of a lot of our peers locally here. So we've seen a lot of movement, a lot of folks reporting pretty good occupancy levels, particularly in their independent living areas, assisted living, certainly much stronger than it was a handful of years ago. We've also seen um, interesting movement when it comes to skilled nursing. I know most folks don't really want to think about skilled nursing. You know, the degradation of the body is a tough thing to think about, especially when you're in relatively good health, right? But a couple interesting phenomenons, both locally and nationally, is we've seen a continued kind of pullback in skilled nursing um, volumes that are out there. So the availability of skilled nursing is at a much lower point than it was a handful of years ago, especially among organizations similar to Holland Home. So Holland Home is a continuing care retirement community. And what you're finding is a lot of, we'll use the acronym CCRCs, or sometimes people use the term life plan community and an LPC. That's what Holland Home is. You're seeing a lot of folks who are in our space kind of scale back their skilled nursing. I mean, Holland Home, frankly, did this 6, 7 years ago. We operated a third campus, which was our Fulton Manor campus, and we made the decision to kind of scale that one back. There was a whole lot that went into that decision, but we weren't the only ones. So we've seen a number of our peers locally also scale back. And so as people are looking for placement, we're certainly seeing them start to think about, okay, so if there's fewer skilled nursing beds, what does that mean for me potentially down the line? So certainly locally and nationally, we've seen really good inflows as far as volumes into communities like Holland Home. Our admissions are at all-time highs. So for us, we're at a really good occupancy rate, and I know our peers are too. Nationally, peer communities are reporting the same thing. And then we're certainly seeing volumes on the community-based side. So in the home care space and things, we're seeing those at kind of peak levels compared to historical. And so we've seen certainly the first initial waves of kind of the early baby boom generation starting to kind of percolate towards facilities like ours, and people are starting to think a little bit more intentionally about, okay, well, what is this going to look like for us? And is a place like Holland home a place we might want to consider? And so certainly from a volume perspective, we're seeing uh, more interest today than we were seeing even 10 years ago.
Okay. And we're kind of dovetailing with that, what you were mentioning there. Because of that, we have wait lists, right? It's not like you can just, I decide I'm going to move tomorrow and move in, especially to independent living. Some of our floor plans, not all of them by any means, but many of them, if the bigger the apartment or home, the longer the wait. I mean, you may wait 5 years or more. Now, if you want a one bedroom, hey, we have inventory right now that you can do. But I think it speaks to what you're talking about is like there has to be some forward thinking on it, and that's so critical. Um, what have you seen, Adam, with people that are making decisions? Because we encounter that in our work all the time about the people that are making a decision versus waiting, and then the family, and there's an emergency making the decision. Can you talk a little bit about some of those observations?
Yeah, the thing we often communicate is no one says after they've moved in, "Oh, I think I moved in too soon." Oftentimes, it's the reverse, and they're typically saying, "Oh man, I kind of wish I would have done this earlier." And I'm not saying that because I represent Holland Home, but I think that's actually probably a comment that most communities hear. I don't think we're unique, frankly, in hearing that comment. And so what we find is oftentimes those who are thinking about and planning for it and kind of are facilitating a move before kind of entering into crisis or kind of feeling like they're forced into it. I think they're able to settle in and really engage and embrace the community that they're a part of. I think they find really good community when they come in. I always say like our best asset are our residents. They're and again, it's going to sound like I'm biased, but there's some pretty remarkable people. I count it a privilege that I get to know some of them, but as opposed to the alternative, which is where folks are feeling like, hey, we've maybe waited too long, and now we need placement. And then what winds up happening is they move into independent living. One spouse is in independent living maybe a year, and then they're moving into assisted living, and then quickly kind of moving through the continuum. And that's really challenging for them because now you're dealing with multiple moves kind of concurrently. And it's not an insignificant move to go from, your home into a community like Holland Home or another community. And so what we encourage people to do, and I think the folks feel most content with, is when they move in and they're able to kind of be a part of that community independent living for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And then they kind of transition through whether it's AL or skilled nursing or things like that. So we've seen a hodgepodge over the years. I think over the last couple of years, we found some that kind of move in and they don't spend a lot of time in independent living, and that's unfortunate. We would really love for them to spend a lot longer in independent living, but we know those who are able to engage with the community fully have given themselves as long a period of time as possible to do so. And usually that's, oftentimes they're thinking about moving in their late 70s. They maybe find their way in their early 80s or even earlier. Again, I'm speaking broad averages here. And then they're able to be in independent living for hopefully quite some time. So does that help answer the
Yeah,
question, Michael?
yeah, it absolutely does. And in what we see from our side of it, from the sales and admissions side, is that the sooner people start and the farther ahead they're planning, the process goes much easier and they're much more calm, right? Making a move at 70 versus 85 is a huge difference, not just in energy levels and things, but everything is easier. And so instead of waiting until there is some crisis, and then you kind of have to kind of take what you can get, if you can get it, where you want to get it. I'm people that have heard me speak have heard me quote this resident that said, "I'd rather be 5 years too soon than 5 minutes too late," because they're trying. This was somebody that came in their late 60s because they wanted to come in, get settled, have the plan, as opposed to waiting until there's some crisis. But you hear this a lot, I'm sure, as we do. Is like, well, I'm just gonna stay home and I'm gonna get home care. Now we've got Atrio Home Care, so we'll make a plug for our colleagues over there. But what can be the problem with that kind of philosophy with like I'm just going to get care at home?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, Michael. So what's a bit unique about Holland Home is that we provide a lot of community-based services too. As Michael alluded to, through Atrio Home Care, we provide care in the home to more than 500 people a day, basically throughout the broader continuum. These aren't people who are necessarily living at Holland Home. We also operate Faith Hospice, and they're caring for 300 plus folks a day. So we're not just facility based. We're actively out delivering care in the community. So we kind of see multiple angles on this. I think this gets to the crux of the core of the topic, which is planning itself. And I'll make a plug. We did a podcast about the cost of care a year or two ago. It's on our podcast This Day and Age. And we kind of talked about some of this. We talked about some broader trends. What's really interesting here is most folks consume healthcare the later third of their life. That's where they're going to consume the bulk of it. So what's really interesting here is you think about it from a consumer's perspective. You spent 2/3 of your life hopefully not spending much time in the U.S. healthcare system. All of a sudden, the later third of your life, that's when unfortunately the body starts to fail you, right? We're finite human beings. It's Unfortunately, that's what happens. You start to engage in the healthcare system more robustly, and the presumption is that things will always be there for you, right? Like the system's been built, like, yep, I have this need, I have a payer, like we should be good, right? That's not that's not always the case. I kind of wish it was. It's some of the tension that we feel today is we're just on the front edge of kind of this cascading demand on in-home services, which is really fascinating. So when you think about it this way, facility-based or in-home services, facility-based, you're able to kind of spread your caregiving labor force over kind of a fixed population, right? So you're able to kind of stretch that one caregiver over maybe 3, 4, 5 persons. It's a it's an efficient model that way. And I know this maybe isn't an appropriate way to talk about it, but that's just kind of how it works versus in-home care, that's 1-to-1. So in-home care model becomes exceptionally more difficult to staff from an efficiency standpoint. One of the phenomenon that it's not a phenomenon. One of the realities that we've been experiencing over the last 3 or 4 years, which is further demonstrated by a lot of national studies on what's caregiving going to look like over the next 20 years as baby boomers kind of move into that higher demand generation when it comes to healthcare consumption, is the reality that the number of caregivers we have to those who need care is going to dramatically decline. And so when we think of it in this way, one modeling has been, if today we have a ratio of, we call it 5 or 6 to 1. So meaning for every person over age 80, we have 5 or 6 people who are in the age bucket of kind of 35 to 55, right? So that's kind of right about where we're at today. And we feel the constraints in our caregiving capacity pretty acutely in the community right now. Well, that's projected to move to over the course of the next 15 years to be 3 to 1. And so the reality is that that's not even economic dependent. That's just the reality of population movement and who's going to be there. And so there's this there's this looming kind of critical shortfall that even if you can afford in-home care, you still might be challenged to find it. And so that's where it gets to the crux of planning and saying, okay, what's my plan A, B, C, and D, right? Like we know most people want to stay in their homes. That's one of the reasons why we provide home care through HRIO and a number of other avenues. We know that. Like if you were to interview me and ask me that question, I would say, yeah, probably by design, I would intend to probably stay in my home, right? But there's a reality that it may not be possible. That might be my plan A. But if I'm not able to find that in-home care simply because of scarcity, not even because I can't pay for it, what's my plan B going to be? Is it going to be an unpaid family caregiver who's helping to support me? Or am I going to have to consider thinking about a plan that involves kind of facility-based care, right? So independent living, assisted living, skilled nursing, something along those lines, right? So that's some of the inherent tension, I think, in the desire to stay in your home and where the availability of caregivers might actually present the most substantial challenge to your ability to do that. And I know a lot of folks make modifications to their homes because that's their plan. And I think that's incredible. And a lot of people do that. And that's amazing that everybody's going to find their way into a Holland home. But there's an X factor here, which is, well, who's going to deliver that care and how have you secured that? And what does that look like? So that's probably how I would frame
Yeah.
that up. That's why when I talk to people, I go, that's great if that's your plan A, like fully support it, amazing. But make sure you're thinking about a plan B or a plan C on top of that as to, what happens if that's just not available to me. What do I go to next? And so how do I kind of maneuver through all of that?
Yeah, and something you just said, I want to expand on it a little bit because it's something you and I have talked about. I know recently Wall Street Journal talked about this. Was you alluded to the fact of maybe having a family member do caregiving in the home. So look, son or daughter step out of the workforce temporarily, part-time or whatever. Talk a little bit about what we're seeing in trends when that happens and what the impact that is.
Yeah, this gets really interesting. It gets to, the whole concept of the sandwich generation, right? Like the folks who are still caring for um, kids who might be college age, high school age, and now they're also caring for an older adult parent. And in this case, the parent needs more hands-on care, and maybe the kids are distributed across the country. They're not able to do as much as they would like for the parents. It falls on one or two adult children to maybe kind of deliver that care. One of the phenomenon that is to be watched and monitored is this whole unpaid caregiver labor force, right? And so one of the concerns we have, and I've expressed this and I've said it to financial advisors, I said, watch this with your clients, because what happens is you might have folks who wind up having to leave the paid workforce early to help deliver care for an aging parent. And so what happens is they wind up shorting themselves on what they had initially planned on to potentially save for their own care or their own retirement needs. And so what happens is their length of time in the workforce gets unexpectedly abbreviated in order to care for this aging parent. So then what that does is it just puts more pressure potentially on each subsequent generation as to what that looks like until there's some kind of pressure release, right? And so that's the area that I'm curious about, and I think nationally is
Mm.
trying to be watched right now is if we're going to come up that much short on paid caregivers, we know the gap is going to have to be made up by unpaid caregivers. So then what's that going to do to the available labor force in every sector, but also within the caregiving labor force? So
Yeah.
it tends to even compress things that much further. And so that's an area where I think study is still emerging, but it's an area of clear concern as far as resources for current and future generations going forward. So it's a thing for kind of all of our communities to kind of pay attention to as to how this potentially cascades into a number of other critical areas of our lives.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, when you're talking about a multi-generational impact, it could be huge, because
Yeah.
you've got people that have stepped out of the workforce and maybe, at a strong point in their career, maybe their peak earning years, and they've stepped out to, take care of mom or dad or what have you, and they're gonna pay a price later for their own care and nest egg, if you will. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see. The more I think that gets looked at, I think now that they're kind of talking about this, it'll be interesting to see the research that gets done in that area.
Yeah, I want to frame this up too, because people could hear me speaking and they're like, man, he sounds super negative and alarmist and all these things. And it's more just these are just observations, right? That mathematically studies have come out that suggest these things. And it's really the crux of the reason why we kind of make sure we're trying to have these conversations with
Right.
folks is to say, hey, you please don't just assume stuff is just going to be there for you. That's that's potentially a dangerous assumption. It's really important to plan whether you get care through Holland Home or one of our affiliates, or you get care through another peer facility. It's more important for us, candidly, that folks are starting to think about this and think through multiple different potential plans and what they want to have happen for
Yeah.
themselves or for a loved one, right? So,
Well, and you touched on it too, that it's about having conversations, right? Some of this stuff, not the most pleasant things to talk about, but it's having a conversation, whether it's within the family, whether it's with your financial advisor or other trusted source. I mean, it's just about having some conversations,
yeah,
and not just kind of thinking about, well, we'll think about that another day. No, you know, we just need to have some conversations. And that's why,
no,
again, that's why we did a webinar like this, is to kind of nudge people to have some of those conversations.
yeah,
So, um, here at Holland Home, if somebody decides to move into Holland Home, they purchase a continuing care agreement, a CCA, that really provides some security. Can you talk a little bit about the continuing care agreement, how it provides security both from a financial standpoint and from a healthcare standpoint, and about cost and predictability of cost, et
yeah,
cetera?
yeah. Okay. Yep. Absolutely. So there's a number of webinars out there specific to the continuing care agreement. So I'm not going to rehash all the specifics on that, and certainly like very specific detailed questions. The sales team is equipped to answer those. So I'm not going to go into really, really fine level detail on that. So I'm not dodging anything there. I'm just for the sake of discussion, just not going to go into that level of detail. But the continuing care agreement, when you enter into it, right, there's two components to it. There's a refundable and a non-refundable. Way to think about it is that the non-refundable piece really represents kind of your cost. That's the piece that ultimately won't come back to you at the time you vacate. But really what a continuing care agreement does fundamentally is it does basically two things, right? So a continuing care agreement says this very, very, very clearly. It says, if you are residing at Holland Home and you have run out of financial resources through no fault of your own, right? You didn't give everything away. You didn't divest of all your assets. You didn't, you didn't kind of intentionally or voluntarily impoverish yourself, right? But through no fault of your own, you kind of have exhausted your financial resources and you're down to very little. We promise to care for you, period, full stop. And we're not gonna like say, well, you got to move to this one, pauper's corner of the campus. That's not how it works. You stay where you are. You stay where you are. The only time that you would move is if you were nursing eligible, and then we would have you potentially consider moving into nursing based on where things stand on some stuff. But you stay where you are. The amazing thing here, from my perspective, is that the folks who are providing care to you have no idea. It's designed that way. So there's probably only a half dozen folks in the whole organization who have access to be able to see. I do, and I don't walk through the halls and know who's on it. I just don't. It's not a thing. We don't memorize it. It's not this big to do on our part. And as we're speaking today, there's probably at least 160 of our residents who are on some form of, we call it resident assistance. Basically, they're paying a discounted rate because they've kind of exhausted much of their resources. So that's one thing. So basically, you're guaranteed a home for as long as you kind of uphold your end of the agreement, which is basically that you just don't intentionally impoverish yourself, more or less. The second piece is that it really guarantees you access throughout the care continuum, right? So if you need assisted living, you're going to move through to assisted living as you need it. If you need memory care, we have dedicated memory care units available in areas of our campuses for you or a loved one to move into. We have skilled nursing on each campus. And so what it really does is it provides you kind of a clear pathway through those higher levels of care. And it really allows us to walk alongside you so that it's not your family or your spouse having to figure out, well, where's he or she going to go to get assisted living or memory care or skilled nursing. But we have staff who are actively embedded in those communities that as you observe certain things with a loved one, we're there to say, yeah, we observe those things too. Here's some clear care navigational steps we can work through to move them through assisted living or memory care or all of that, and kind of walk them through it. So you're not having to wonder, well, where are they going to end up? Like it's the pathway has been carved for them. It's more a question of at what pace, or maybe they never move through the pathway, and maybe they stay in independent living until they, pass away at an amazingly advanced age. But that's the secondary critical benefit of the continued care agreement, is that it guarantees you access through that entire continuum.
Yeah, and I think what what it also affords people and what we hear from our side of it, from the sales side, especially people in independent living and the like, is that they have some predictability in their costs. So they know every month, here's what my monthly fee is going to be and roughly what my utilities are. They're not worried about, oh, the furnace is making a funny noise. What am I going to do about that? Like if you're in
Yeah.
your own home, or if you're in a condo in the community, or the refrigerator. Like, what do I do? Where am I going to get one? Am I going to get a good deal? How quick can I get it? It takes all of those things. There's a predictability of it. Now the rate goes up once a year, um, but even at that, it's notified well in advance. I think last year would it go up $40 or something, but there is that predictability. And what residents tell me is that it's such a peace of mind. And they've several of them have said to me, I didn't realize how much I worried about my house until I didn't have to worry
Mm.
about it anymore. Because now if there's some noise or something, like, oh well, that's Holland Home's deal, not my deal. So I think that whole idea of planning, having some predictability, is huge. And so it helps manage those costs.
Yeah,
Um,
you're right. I forgot that part of your question, Michael. Yes, you're exactly right. It does particularly secure that, right? So Holland Home's responsible for that real estate, for that asset. So if something breaks in that unit, grass is mowed, driveways are plowed, all of that stuff, that's fully on Holland Home and our team. So yeah, absolutely, from a peace of mind perspective, you just get to live in that space and be a
yeah,
part of that community and enjoy your neighbors and your friends and your family, um, and just celebrate the vibrancy of life, right?
right. Yeah. Yeah. We always say, you have time to do the things you want to do, not the things you have to do.
Yeah.
Because, Always fun to call people in the fall when they're out raking leaves, and I remind them, well, if you were living here, you wouldn't have to be out there raking leaves. So, um, but you touched on something there regarding pay, and we talked about independent living, and modest monthly fee, predictable. But talk a little bit about, and I know you alluded to a podcast we did on this day and age regarding paying for care. Talk a little bit about what the payment structure looks like for assisted living, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there that they think Medicare pays for it or something like that.
Yeah, this is a common misconception. But Medicare does not cover assisted living. So in and of itself, straight Medicare does not cover it. Medicare Advantage does not cover it. It's not a covered benefit, which also means, in-home assistance is also not a covered Medicare benefit, and in most cases is not a covered Medicare Advantage benefit. There might be exceptions to that every once in a while, but generally for the vast majority of folks, assisted living is not a covered benefit under their current health insurance plan. It might be a covered benefit under a long-term care policy. That is, if we see something other than kind of straight out-of-pocket costs, we'll call it private pay. For some folks, it might be because they have a long-term care policy that picks up a portion of that assisted living care. Now, most long-term care policies also have finite maximum spend levels. So eventually that will potentially run out depending on what kind of long-term care coverage that you have. But it does come at a pretty significant surprise for most folks, again, who haven't spent a lot of time consuming a vast amount of healthcare and are maybe new to the Medicare program, that assisted living is not a covered benefit under Medicare and most Med Advantage plans. So it's typically fully private pay, meaning it's out of your pocket. And that can be a bit of a shocking reality. And if folks aren't aware of that, it makes it really hard for them to actually plan for that,
Yeah,
later in life. And they go, well, what happens if I do need assisted living? Well, my Medicare is going to pay for it. Well, not as of today. It's not. Neither is your Med Advantage plan, if you're on one of those. So um, that's that's why it's important to have these conversations with your financial advisors too, to say, okay, how well am I setting myself up for any of my potential long-term care needs here? I know it's tough. Um, People don't want to spend their money on things, but eventually folks may need that care. So it's important to have those conversations.
yeah. Well, as we kind of wrap up this part of the conversation and then open it up for question and answer, where we talking about just navigating the journey, you touched on that a little bit about kind of walking alongside people. Talk a little bit about that, like why that's such an advantage today of like, look, I'm in the hospital, I've had a fall, I know what my plan is. Can you talk a little bit about why that again, because for those that have done pre-planning and it make it easier. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the unexpected circumstance, right, that folks maybe find themselves in the hospital and they need to discharge out, and they're going to discharge to skilled nursing care. A lot of folks, if you've ever found yourself in this situation, you kind of go, well, where should I go? Like what hospital feels like a natural, like, if my child needs to go to the hospital, I'm not like, well, which hospital do I go to? Which one should I go to? It's kind of like, well, whatever one is the closest, right? Somehow it feels different when it comes to skilled nursing. It's kind of like, well, which one, you kind of like presented with this whole list, right? And you're like, well, where do I think about? So one of the inherent benefits, right? So if you're living at Holland home, you wind up having to go to the hospital, get ready to discharge out, you know exactly where you're going to go, right? And you know you're going to have a place there. You're not going to have to wonder, well, is this 4 or 5 star nursing facility actually going to have a bed available to me, or might I end up, because there's no beds available at a 4 or 5 star nursing facility, I might end up going to 1 or 2 star. And the star rating system, most people aren't familiar with that. So Medicare maintains a star rating system, right? So for skilled nursing providers, there's 1 through 5 stars. Five being the best, and then one being um, what it is, right? Not that great, or typically kind of poor quality, or for whatever reason they find themselves kind of in the lower end of the heap, right? So, and most people are like, well, I mean, it's natural. I want the best. I want 4 or 5 star. So the benefit here is if you're, within the Holland Home continuum, you're going to be able to come back to a Holland Home skilled nursing facility, which are, 4 or 5 star, rated facilities. You know what the staffing levels are. We're well above state and national minimums when it comes to these things. If you then need to find your way into assisted living, that's kind of preset for you. And we have staff who, when folks discharge to the hospital, typically get notified that a resident's gone to the hospital. So they're going to follow up and say, hey, what's your plan of discharge? When are you thinking about coming back? They'll coordinate with the directors of nursing and skilled nursing and say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Jones is set to discharge on this day. Let's make sure, we have, certain rooms available for him or her, and they kind of coordinate through all of that, right? So uh, that's where it's just a thing that most people don't really think about, because up until that point, it's been a natural flow for them through the healthcare system. Like, well, I go to the hospital. This is the hospital I go to because it's the closest to me, or it's the one that my physician is, credentialed at, or the one I was born at, or whatever it is, and that's kind of how it goes. But um, that kind of peace of mind or that care coordination really comes into play when you're one of our residents. We're gonna basically try and follow you wherever you go, so that we know that as you come back in from wherever you might have gone, we're finding that space for you that you need, and having those conversations with you and your loved ones to make sure everything's set.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of our most passionate prospective residents are people maybe we've been working with that haven't moved in yet, and they've had a fall and they've had to go to rehab temporarily or something. And they went to, they had to go to one of those 1 or 2 star places because that's who had an open bed. And then they come back to us and the team and say, I'm not doing that again. I want to be at Holland Home because I want to have a plan. But I can I have more than can fit on 2 hands of the number of people that that's happened to in my time here. And when they come back and say, yeah, that is not, I don't want that to happen again. And so they end up making the decision to come to Holland Home because they want that plan, they want that promise. So many of them view this as a gift to their children. Just was working with somebody last week. They said this is our gift to our kids because our kids are all busy. They're all over the country. This is our gift, one of our gifts to them. So, any parting thoughts before we open up? I know we have some questions. Do you have any other comments here?
I would, the most important thing for me, and I said it earlier, so I'm going to say it again, because to me, this is the most important thing. Honestly, this is a thing that I've um, started to speak more with my parents about too, is really, the necessity to be willing to have some of these conversations, both, between spouses, and say, hey, what's really meaningful to me? What do I want to have happen for us, and provide for us as far as our future care needs go, and thinking through that. And it can be an uncomfortable conversation, right? Because you're talking about something that you don't want to have happen.
Mhm.
And we fully get that. I fully get that. This isn't a conversation that I want to have with my parents or my spouse either, but it's a conversation that I know, if we're willing to have that conversation, it means when that moment arises, um, we've kind of already worked through what was the tough part.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not having to work through the tough part in crisis. that I think is the true gift of planning. You can be present, your spouse can be present, your kids can be present, and just be concerned about themselves and being in the roles that they're in, which is child, spouse, loved one, and the care has largely been orchestrated or planned to the extent possible for you. And that's what this is more about for folks. It's just trying to make sure that people are willing to be comfortable having some of these conversations. And you're not going to have all the answers, and you can have so many questions, and
Mhm.
that's fine. And that's why we do these kind of webinars. It's not, in all honesty, this isn't to sell Holland Home or Atria, although we would love for folks
Mhm.
to find their way to Holland Home. We also know that not everybody can or will. But it's more from our perspective to try and continue to keep these conversations in front of our community, to say this is important for us to know that people are having these conversations. And so that's, as much as this conversation felt like a lot of mentions of like scarcity and all of this,
Mhm.
it's really more about making sure that people are feeling more comfortable and equipped to have this dialogue with themselves. And Holland Home is more than happy to be a potential resource to help people have these conversations.
Yeah. And we see that with the people we're working with here, in the front lines with prospective residents. And it just, I would say in the last year or so, I had somebody I was working with personally that um, they decided to go to a different community that was outside the area, outside of our area. Um, and they kind of had narrowed it down to between the two communities, and it's fine, and they decided on the other community. And I said, well, can I ask, have you gone on their wait list? Well, no, they've got to, I like, get on their wait list. So the point is, we want you to plan. Yes, we hope you come to Holland Home. Yes, we hope you use services that are part of our continuum, like Atrio. But our point is please make a plan, because you're gonna be happier, your family's gonna be happier. You're gonna be better prepared for when there are needs. So um, anyway, so questions. So if you have questions for Adam or myself, just type it into the Q&A box and we'll do our best to answer them. The question here from Kevin, I think this came in early in our webinar. Did you scale back on skilled nursing because more is provided through home health care?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I would say there are, yes, there are a couple of reasons why we've seen a scale back in skilled nursing. One is reimbursement, honestly, has not been that great. And so we found a lot of facilities have struggled to cover their costs through the reimbursement they get. Um, and that reimbursement is typically either coming through Medicare, Medicaid, or Medicare Advantage plans. And some of that has been really challenging, more so candidly, on the Med Advantage plan side, their reimbursement has been somewhat challenging. So that's one of the reasons why we dialed back a little bit. Another reason was because we were seeing more care kind of shifting away from folks discharging out of the hospital to skilled nursing and kind of bypassing skilled nursing and going to home health. So it was a combination of multiple things, and that's what I think a lot of facilities have seen. That doesn't mean there's still not a critical need for skilled nursing, but from our standpoint, the volume of beds we had, the level of effort it was taking to keep them full, because we were, admitting a lot of folks who weren't necessarily part of our continuum into those. It was becoming untenable, given the level of reimbursement we were getting on those.
And would you say, I'm going to put you on the spot, would you say that the way Holland Home also we staff assisted living at such high care levels, like what most would staff in a skilled nursing? In other words, our ratio or patient ratio, all of that in assisted living is much higher than most. Do you feel like that had an impact on kind of right sizing our skilled nursing?
Yeah, I think it had some impact. I mean, our staffing levels, as you alluded to, in our assisted living, in a lot of spaces are at or close to state and national minimums for skilled nursing. And in a lot of cases, our staffing ratios are like well above that. Particularly in our memory care areas, our staffing ratios are considerably higher than that. And so that does come into play. What's interesting is through the years, if you went way back, the level of care being provided in skilled nursing today is much closely with what used to be provided in a hospital setting. And what's getting delivered in assisted living is today is a little bit more what used to be getting delivered in skilled nursing maybe 20 years ago. And so it's kind of been this
Hmm.
gradual shift as people are able to age in place longer. You're kind of seeing shifts in how significant the acuity of care is in each of these environments. So there's certainly some of that at play.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Oh, good. Any other questions? That I thought we had more. We had one. So either we've overwhelmed them, or we've given them so much information that they're drinking from a fire hose or something. So any other questions that we might have out there before we wrap things up here? I'm not seeing one. So do you have a takeaway, Adam? I mean, we kind of talked about why we did this webinar. What if you bottom lined it? You're a CFO. What if you bottom lined it for us?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple things to additional things I didn't, mention. But certainly the cost of care. This, to be honest, if somebody asked me, "Hey, what's the thing that like keeps you up at night?" Honestly, that's one of those things. Right? Is the cost to deliver care. We know the majority of our costs are people related.
Mm,
Um, and with the caregiving, giving labor force, the challenges that we've seen over the last couple of years, and that we know we're going to continue to see, that's an area where I get concerned about kind of future cost directions there and how we can architect away as much of what's likely going to be a continuing rising cost environment, how we can get as efficient as possible without impacting our staffing ratios or anything like that, right? So from our perspective, anything that affects care quality is a no-go zone for us.
mhm.
So it's that level of creativity and how we can make sure we're scaling appropriately and things like that. So that's an element where um, the cost environment is still exceptionally challenging for us when it comes to delivering care both in the facility and in the community. And that's a tough thing to plan for too in the future because there's always a lot of noise coming out of the regulatory environment as to changes and adjustments they want to make and how that might impact or not impact cost and things like that. And so it's important to think about, especially as you're talking with financial advisors, saying, "Hey, what are our future cost assumptions when it comes to the cost of care on top of this too?" We didn't talk about that, but that's you said as a CFO, like, well, here's the CFO saying, like, I'm staring at cost trajectories and things and trying to figure out how we can keep our costs as low as possible, keep our quality as high as it has always been, if not continue to improve on it. That's another area. So again, it all comes back to kind of planning and what that looks like and having those conversations. And it's interesting is when we have these planning conversations, Michael, it's like I'm talking, it's like I'm at church. I'm like, oh, this message is for me too, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Like it 100% is.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
hear myself talking and I go, hey, pay attention to what you're saying and
Yeah.
and not be
Yeah.
hypocritical here and make sure I'm having these same conversations with my own family too.
Yeah.
But that's probably what my bottom line takeaway would be
Sure.
is
And we talked a lot about this planning, and one of the questions that came in is, what would you recommend? Where should someone start? Like, to your point, I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about like it can be overwhelming. So if you were giving advice, where would be a good first step to start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna be a little self-serving in this because I again, I work at Holland Home, right? So I actually think our website's a pretty good space to start. We have a whole, I don't know how many webinars we're up to at this point, Michael. But those are, I think folks have found those really helpful. So I would encourage people to kind of maybe start there and then kind of start to branch out. If you have a financial advisor, I would certainly speak with them and say, hey, can we talk about some of this stuff? And what are your thoughts on some of these things, and how have you seen other clients kind of do this? Certainly, if you have an attorney, I'd ask them. I'd really go to people that you trust, and that might be a valuable advisor or sounding board in this space. But certainly, a website like Holland Homes and looking at the webinars that we have, I think that's a pretty valuable place to start, to be honest, and then you can kind of branch out from there, for sure.
Yeah, it's great advice. Well, again, we thank you, Adam, for joining us today for our webinar. I'm going to put a plug in that, Adam is here in Grand Rapids. Holland Home continues to be locally owned and managed. Our leadership team is right in the community. Um, Unlike some of our peer communities that are managed on the east side of the state or out of state, we still are local. And so I think that makes a big difference. And so I put that plug in for Holland Home. And again, I think the advice is start, do some planning, and I think as people look into the new year, I think sometimes people are like, you know what, I'm going to get some stuff in order. So maybe use this webinar as a catalyst to have those conversations, probably with your family and then with some of the professionals like Adam was talking about. And we're here to help too if we can do anything to help facilitate those conversations. But if there's nothing else, we encourage you to tune in to our next webinar next month about the real estate market. And thanks for joining us today. And we hope you have a great holiday, and we'll see you in 2025.
Yeah.
So thanks, everybody.
Yeah.